Good evening. Tonight we're going to have a review of the Old Testament books, 39 of them. The first 5 books are called the books of Moses, the Torah. Genesis is a very important book, has 50 chapters, covers more time than any other book, more events than any other book in the Old Testament. From creation to the death of Joseph, the creation of man, the fall of man, the first murder, the beginning of the nations, the beginning of marriage, Noah and the flood. Noah was given instructions by God on how to build an ark. The people around him laughed at him as he was working on the ark. They laughed until the rain began. Then we have the great man Abraham and his wife Sarah and their bondservant Hagar. God promised to make Abraham's descendants as many as the stars in the sky. Promised him a son when they were up in age. Sarah really didn't believe that God would actually do that. She decided to take things in her own hand. And she told Abraham to go into Hagar for a son named Ishmael. We have the death of Abraham and his sons, Ishmael and Isaac buried him. Then the two twin sons were born. Esau had the birthright. Jacob came out second. Eventually, Esau sells his birthright for some stew. When Isaac was old, Rebekah told Jacob to fix his dad some wild game and to deceive him into thinking he was Esau to get the blessings, and not to Esau. Jacob had many sons with his wives. Joseph was his favorite son. He made him a coat of many colors. His brothers were very jealous of him, and they sold him to a caravan headed for Egypt. They put blood on his coat and told his father that a wild beast must have killed him. He was sold to Egypt, and God takes care of Joseph while he's in Egypt. He was promoted to high authority and reads the dreams of Pharaoh, tells him there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And he was to prepare for that. Jacob sends his sons to get grain. Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize Joseph. Eventually, Jacob brings his family and they settle in the land of Goshen. The Hebrews were very fruitful and multiplied greatly in the land. The book of Exodus. The new king did not know Joseph. He was worried that the Israelites would join up with their enemies, and so he enslaved them. And the more they were enslaved, the more they multiplied. Pharaoh made a rule to kill all the male babies that were born to the Hebrews. This is the time when Moses was born. He was hidden in a river in a basket. Pharaoh's daughter finds him. Moses is raised by the Egyptians, and when he was grown, he returned to his people. Moses saw his people being afflicted by an Egyptian, and he killed him. And then he fled to Midian for 40 years. Moses was tending sheep, and he sees a burning bush, and he was told by God that he wanted him to go to Egypt and rescue his people. Moses tries to get out of it. God persists. Moses has showed many miracles and signs to show to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was very angry with Moses and made the Hebrews work twice as hard by gathering their own straw to make bricks. God promised to deliver the Hebrews. He caused 10 plagues to come on the Egyptians. And the Hebrews put blood on their doorposts so God would pass over their houses and not take the firstborn. And then the Hebrews escaped and they were headed for the Red Sea. Pharaoh thought about it and realized that he didn't have any slaves to do all of his work, so he pursued them. And the Red Sea had parted for the Hebrews, and once they had crossed, the Egyptians entered into the Red Sea also. Once they were in the middle of it, God closed the water, destroying the Egyptian army. He also gave the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, gives the instructions for the tabernacle and the building of the altar. While Moses was away on Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments, the people thought that he wasn't coming back. So they convinced Aaron to make a golden calf. When Moses returned, he saw the golden calf, and he threw the tablets down and broke them. All through the Old Testament, God reminds the children of Israel how I brought you out of Egypt with a strong hand. We have the book of Leviticus next. It's the priestly book. They're given all the laws of offering and forgiveness of sin, how to sacrifice animals. Aaron and his sons are consecrated as priests. Eventually, 2 of his sons were killed for using unauthorized fire for the sacrifices. We have the book of Numbers. A census of the warriors was taken. We know how many people came out of Egypt that were 18 and above. Also, the directions on how to set up the camp were given. The people constantly murmured and wanted to return to Egypt. Spies were sent to Canaan to check it out, the land of Canaan, to check it out. While they were gone, we have the rebellion of the Korathites. They rebelled against Aaron and Moses, and God opened up the earth and swallowed 250 of them. And then a plague came upon them and killed over 14,000. Then another census was taken after the plague. And the Lord said, "This generation will die in the wilderness because of their unfaithfulness, except for Joshua and Caleb." When the spies returned to camp, only 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, had positive answers. The rest were scared, and they stirred up the camp. And the people were afraid and refused to enter the promised land. Moses had to convince them to enter. Then the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy recounts Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. The 10 Commandments were given again in chapter 5. We have the death of Moses and Joshua taken over. Moses was allowed to look at the promised land, but not to enter. When Joshua had taken over, he sent spies to check out Jericho. And Rahab, a prostitute, hid the spies and was rewarded by her family and her being safe when they were going to attack Jericho. Israel is in battle against the Ai, and Joshua asks for more time so that he can defeat them. And the sun stood still for long enough for them to defeat Ai. The book of Judges. After they crossed over the Jordan, Israel had judges, 15 of them, from Othniel to Samuel. They judged Israel against their enemies. The book was written from a viewpoint that Israel needed a king. Every man done what was good in his own eyes. Our brother Jamie Jacobs had a picture of a circle, and Israel prospers. Then Israel disobeys God. And Israel is punished. And then we have Israel crying out, and we have God restoring them. Time and time again through the book of Judges. The book of Ruth. Elimelech and Naomi had 2 sons, and they married 2 Moabite women named Ruth and Orpah. Elimelech and his 2 sons eventually die, leaving Naomi and her 2 daughter-in-laws. She told them to stay in their land, and she was going to return to the Jews. Oprah listened and stayed. Ruth refused to stay and went with Naomi back to her home, to Naomi's home. And she said, "Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And where you die, I will also die." So they went back. Ruth and Boaz are eventually married, and they have Obed, which is the father of Jesse, who is the father of King David. We have 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel starts with the birth of Samuel. His mother, Hannah, is in the temple praying, the tabernacle, praying for her son, praying for a son, for she was not able to have children. And Eli was the priest at the time. He saw her lips moving, but did not hear her praying, and he accused her of being drunk. When she explained to him that she was praying for a son, he said, "Whatever you're asking for, let it be done for you." So Samuel was born, and she gave him to the Lord. He was trained in the ways of God through Eli. When he grows up, he tells God that Israel is demanding a king. God says, "They're not rejecting you, they are rejecting me." Saul was anointed king, and he was good at first, and then not so much later. He turned from God, and then God turned from him. David was anointed king. Eventually, Saul and his sons were killed in battle, and David weeps for the death of Saul and his son Jonathan, which was a close friend of his. When David was king, he saw a beautiful woman named Bathsheba. He found out she was married to one of his military persons. And he sent him to the front lines so he could be put to death, so he could have Bathsheba. Nathan the prophet rebukes David for this. She was pregnant, and when the child was born, he was born dead. Then we have the birth of Solomon. His dad, King David, takes a census, an unauthorized census, and the Lord was very angry with him. He caused a pestilence to come over Israel and killed over 70,000 people. The book of 1 Kings, Solomon is anointed as king. God tells him he can have whatever he wants, and he asks for wisdom so that he can lead God's people correctly. God was so pleased with his asking for wisdom to take care of his people that he gave him wisdom and wealth. Solomon builds the temple. Solomon married foreign wives, and eventually Solomon fell away from God. Then there was Elijah, the great prophet. He was in a competition with the prophets of Baal. So they built 2 altars to their gods. Elijah built a altar for God Almighty, and the prophets of Baal built one for their god, Baal also. They had 2 bulls to sacrifice. The prophets of Baal were allowed to go first. So they prayed from morning till noon for Baal to light their altar. Then Elijah started taunting them. He said, maybe he's asleep, or maybe he's on a journey. Still they cried out to Baal to light the fire, and of course nothing happened. Then Elijah prayed for God to show his power, and fire came down from heaven. It consumed the bull, the wood, the stones, and lapped up the water in the trench that he had poured on before it was lit. 2 Kings, Elijah is pulled up in a whirlwind to heaven. 2 Kings is also about all the kings of Israel and Judah, 19 of them on both sides. A lot of them, most of them, did what was evil in the sight of God. Only a few were faithful and trusted God. First Chronicles, from chapter 1 through chapter 9, is the genealogy from Abraham to the captivity in Babylon. It was to teach the people that were returning from captivity of who their grandparents were, who their great-parents were, and where they had came from. The rest of First Chronicles is about King David and his mighty era, to remind the people of how much God loved David. And to remind Second Chronicles is about Solomon. And it was to remind the returning exiles of how good things were when they were faithful to God. The book of Ezra. Ezra was a priest who lived in the time of Cyrus, the king of Persia. And he wanted to return all the Jews back to their land and all the treasures from God's house that Nebuchadnezzar had taken. Cyrus also wanted them to repair the temple. So Ezra was sent to teach the returning exiles and to rebuild the altar and rebuild the temple. The book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was also in the time of the returning exiles that Cyrus had turned loose. He rebuilds the wall of Jerusalem. There were many people that opposed him. Ended up having to give half of the people tools and the other half of the people weapons to defend themselves. Ezra gathers all the people and reads the law to them. Then we have the book of Esther. Ahasuerus was king, and he reigned from India to Ethiopia. He was having a party when they all got merry in their hearts. He wanted Queen Vashti to come and dance for everyone, for she was very beautiful. She refused. King Ahasuerus removed her, and they were looking for a new queen. Mordecai had taken his niece in to raise her as his own daughter. Esther was one of the contenders for the queen's position, and eventually she was chosen to be the new king. And her uncle Mordecai knew that there was a plot to kill all the Jews. Mordecai convinces Esther to go in before the king and tell him of the plot against her people. When the plot was exposed, King Ahasuerus promoted Mordecai to a high-ranking position in the kingdom. And then there was a decree put out where the Jews could wipe out all of their enemies on a certain day. And they did. The Jews killed 75,000 of their enemies on that day. And the Jews added a feast, the Feast of Purim, to remember how Esther had saved them. The book of Job. Job lived in the time of Abraham or even before. It is known as the oldest story, one of the oldest stories in the Bible. Job lived in the land of Oz, where he was an upright and blameless man who feared God. Satan was allowed to test him. Satan said that Job was only faithful to God because God had made him wealthy and protected him. Satan was allowed to touch him and take his possessions and his health. Job had 3 friends that heard of his calamity. They ended up coming to help him, but in the end, they didn't help him at all. They ended up condemning him, saying that the reason he was being punished is he had done something wrong. Job said, "Though he slays me, him will I serve." God rebukes his friends and returns Job's fortune. The book of Psalms. David wrote 150 psalms for the Jewish worship. And they were sang in the synagogues and the temples and all the places of worship for years. The book of Proverbs was written by Solomon. His wise sayings, like a slack hand causes poverty. A soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. Humility comes before honor. The book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes was written by an old man. And he's looking back over his life. And he says, vanity of vanities, all is vanities. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains the same forever. A stream runs to the sea, but the sea is never full. By the end of the book, he says, since all has been heard, this is the end of the matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Songs of Solomon. Beautiful words of love between a man and his wife. Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet. He had many words to say about the coming Christ. Like he had no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men. A man of sorrows, he was despised. We esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our grief. He was persecuted. He was persecuted for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. With his wounds we are healed. He was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He bore the sins of many and made intercessions for our transgressions. The book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah means the Lord set apart. The Lord told him, before you were formed in your mother's womb, I knew you, and I wanted to make you a prophet. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is him. Behold, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant. Lamentations is also by Jeremiah. The Lord has destroyed without pity. Restore us to you, O Lord. Lamentations was over the fall of Jerusalem. We have the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was in captivity. The Lord called him to be a prophet for Israel. God told him not to be afraid of them or afraid of their words. The Lord provided him a scroll, and he ate it. He said it was sweet as honey. And then Ezekiel was to tell Israel what the scroll said. He had a vision of the valley of dry bones, where the bones were forming together. This was to represent the return of Israel to power. The book of Daniel. Daniel was taken to Babylon. He didn't want to be defiled by the king's food, so he ate vegetables and drank water. And at the end of the time, when they tested him to see if he was strong enough just eating the vegetables and drinking the water, he was 10 times in better shape than any of the rest of the wise men. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He went to all the wise men and the enchanters to tell him the meaning of the dream. And no one could. Daniel made an appointment to see the king and to tell him the meaning of the dream with the help of God. He said it was going to be 4 kingdoms set up before God would set up his kingdom, a never-ending kingdom. Daniel was promoted through the ranks. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were put in a furnace, and an angel kept them safe. Nebuchadnezzar had a second dream. Daniel was afraid to tell him the meaning of it, and he said, "You must tell me." So Daniel said he was going to be put outside and eat grass like an ox for a period of time. When he came to his senses, he blessed the Most High God and praised him. And then Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was restored. When his son Belshazzar took over, he was having a party, and they were drinking out of the vessels of the Lord from the Lord's house that had been taken from the temple. And there was a finger doing some writing on the wall, and they couldn't read it. Eventually, Daniel came and read it to them, and said that Belshazzar's life would be taken from him. And that night he was killed. Daniel was put in the lion's den, and the Lord's angel sealed the lion's mouth, and he wasn't touched. The book of Hosea. God told Hosea to marry a woman of whoredom and to have children with her. The first son's name was to be Jezreel. This is where God was going to punish Israel, in the valley of Jezreel. Then she had a daughter, and God said, name her No Mercy, because God was going to show no mercy to Israel. The book of Joel. Joel talks about the locusts. What the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust has left, the hopping locust has eaten. And what the hopping locust has left, the destroying locust has eaten, starving the people and their animals to punish them for their sins. The book of Amos. God punishes all the nations that he used to punish Israel because he loved Israel. And the second message of Amos is Israel's oppression of the poor and the lack of justice and their fake worship. God was angry with Israel and caused his people to suffer. The book of Obadiah. Obadiah recounts the downfall of Jerusalem and condemns Edom for their part in the catastrophe. There are three themes of Obadiah: the sovereignty of God, the judgment of God, and the triumph of God. The book of Jonah. Jonah was a prophet that God sent to Nineveh to call out against the people's evil. Jonah rose up and fled to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He got on a boat, and a great wind came upon to where the ship was threatened to sink. So he was thrown overboard, and a great fish swallowed him up. He was in the belly of the fish for 3 days. When he came to his senses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fish vomited him out on dry land. And then Jonah went on to Nineveh. The book of Micah. My good defense, God is being just, and that there are good reasons that Israel and Judah is being punished. Micah warns of the impending judgment. Micah also held out for hope of God's restoration of Israel and Judah. The book of Nahum. Nahum prophesies the downfall of Nineveh and Assyria. The destruction of Assyria is an image of how God will confront and bring down all violent human empires. This is about God's commitment to justice. The book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk offers a picture of a prideful people being humbled while the righteous live by faith in God. It also tells of the people's confidence in the Lord, and it tells us God is sovereign, and God is omnipotent. There you go. Habakkuk had violence and conflict and injustice being done all around him. He felt that God was doing nothing about it. He openly questioned God. "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you don't hear me?" The book of Zephaniah. Judgment, restoration, justice, and hope. He warns Israel and the surrounding nations that the day of the Lord is near. Hold on and trust God's promises, knowing that he will preserve and protect the faithful ones. Haggai affirms that the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem and peace will finally come to Jerusalem. Zechariah. Visions to rebuild the temple and gathering the scattered people of Israel, and a triumphant of Israel over their enemies. Malachi. God's judgment is coming on his enemies. God's people need to be more concerned about their relationship with God and not worrying about the fate of the other countries that God was going to punish. Israel is condemned for the practice of unworthy sacrifices and idolatry. Malachi emphasizes the necessity of proper worship. After Malachi, it was 400 years until John the Baptist. That is a review of the Old Testament books. Thank you very much.